I can't remember exactly when I first started to notice it, but going back at least 15 or more years, I remember that I started to notice when I was at talks in Vietnam or talking with people at conferences that this idea would keep coming up that in distant antiquity, there was a time when the ancestors of the people we now call the Vietnamese, the ancestors of the Viet, occupied the area of what is today China, and that these people created the foundations of what we consider Chinese or East Asian civilization, particularly things like the I Ching or the Ginzik. And there was still more theories that I would hear about something about how these people were agriculturalists and that the Han Chinese, who were pastoralists, then came in and basically stole all of this stuff, which these people argued was stuff that had been originally created by the ancestors of the Vietnamese. And, I heard this stuff and part of me was thinking, this stuff, it just was kind of crazy because it's like, where the heck are these ideas coming from? But then, the historian in me was really curious to know, like, where did these ideas come from? And so I started examining that. And the more I've looked, the more interesting it has become. And over the course of the next few videos, what I'd like to do is to talk about this idea, and in particular, to look at some of the Western scholarship that it is based on, because the current version of this concept relies a lot on Western scholarship, and that Western scholarship has some serious problems. So let's take a look. So if you look around the internet today, the name that probably will pop up the most in relation to this idea is that of an author by the name of Ha Van Thuy. Ha Van Thuy has written a lot about this idea that in distant antiquity, the ancestors of the Viet migrated first into the area of what is today China, and that they brought agricultural technology and laid the foundations for what later became Chinese civilization, because the Chinese stole it. They came in. So today, if you look around on the internet, the name that you'll find most closely associated with this idea that the ancestors of the Viet were the first to migrate into the area of what is today China and create a civilization there is a writer by the name of Ha Van Thuy. Over the past decade or so, Ha Van Thuy has written a lot about this topic. And, when you read his ideas, again, I became curious to know where these ideas came from. And as I looked back in time, I came to realize that you can go all the way back to at least the 1940s and find a kind of mysterious writer by the name of Li Dong-a, who wrote a bit about this. But then he was assassinated in the 40s. And you have to jump ahead in time for a couple more decades until the 1960s, when a philosopher by the name of Luong Kim Dinh started to write a lot about this idea in the 1960s in South Vietnam. Luong Kim Dinh was from the north, but he went to France starting around 1948, I think, and spent a decade there studying philosophy and essentially like East Asian studies or sinology. And then when he came back to Vietnam in the 1960s, he went to South Vietnam where he worked in universities and published a lot. Luong Kim Dinh was very concerned with Vietnamese society at that time. You had a communist North and a non-communist South, and Luong Kim Dinh felt that neither of these ideologies at the time were capable of preserving Vietnamese culture. And in particular, he feared that Westernization would destroy Vietnamese culture in the South, and he created a kind of philosophy to try to solidify Vietnamese culture. And an important aspect of that philosophy was an historical foundation that he established, which was this idea that the Viet had been the first people in East Asia, that they created the foundation for a cultural tradition, that the Chinese later appropriated that, and that the Viet then had to kind of flee southward into the area of what is today Vietnam. This cultural tradition that Luong Kim Dinh said existed prior to the arrival of Han Chinese in East Asia, he referred to as Viet Nha. Nha is the word meaning something like scholarship, or it's often used to refer to Confucian scholarship, and Viet is, of course, Viet. And Luong Kim Dinh essentially wanted to say that all of this stuff that's part of what we think of as East Asian civilization or Chinese civilization actually has its roots in Viet civilization. And therefore, Vietnamese should be very proud of themselves as they have this very ancient history and a history of, creativity and of establishing an important cultural tradition that he felt they should be preserving in the 1960s and not letting Western culture destroy or transform. So Luong Kim Dinh wrote a lot about this in the 1960s, but in 1975 he went to the US and his books were banned in Vietnam until very recently. Nonetheless, somehow or other in the 1990s, there was another scholar who started to revive these ideas. That is a gentleman by the name of Nguyen Tem, who started to write what we can think of as sort of cultural textbooks for the state educational system at the university level in the 1990s. Like Luong Kim Dinh, Nguyen Tem was afraid that Vietnamese culture would be destroyed. And in the 1990s, he was afraid not specifically of Westernization, but of globalization. Because after Vietnam kind of entered the world in the post-Doi Mới era, there was a fear, not just by Nguyen Tem, but of many people at the time, as there was in places like China, that globalization would seriously threaten the culture and the society, and therefore it needed to be solidified. And the way that Nguyen Tem tried to do it was in a way very similar to Luong Kim Dinh, that is by creating a kind of historical, philosophical summary of everything that he felt Vietnamese society and culture was, and try to get people to believe in that. And in doing this, he brought back these ideas that Luong Kim Dinh had talked about, where in particular this idea that the Viet had been the first people in East Asia, had created a foundation for East Asian civilization, and then the Han Chinese came and took that. So this is all really interesting stuff, and it's, as you can see, there's this long tradition, if you will, in at least the southern half of Vietnam in the half century, the final half century of the 20th century, of people having this idea that the Viet were the first people in East Asia to create what came to be known as East Asian civilization. So those ideas were there, and as Luong Kim Dinh went into the diaspora, those ideas also, spread in the diaspora, and we can find evidence of them in, say, the U.S. in the 80s and 90s. But when you read the types of writings that Havan Thuy has from this century, there's many more details in them. He talks about genetics, about archaeology, and all of that is stuff that came later. And in particular, it came in the late 1990s as some individuals living in the diaspora overseas started to revisit this issue of ancient history and started to employ the work of Western scholars in making their point. And that's where Western scholarship intersects with this kind of tradition of thinking about the past in Vietnam. And it's where things get really interesting. And that's what we're going to start looking at in the next video.